Next up, I want to invite up Christophe Coenraets from Adobe. He's going to go into a little more depth on PhoneGap and PhoneGap Build. Christophe?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So it was great to see brackets in action and see how easy it makes it to write HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And in this session, we're going to see how we can use the same technologies, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, to actually build mobile applications. And first, I'd like to review actually the challenge when you don't use web technologies to build these mobile applications, but when you use the default approach, which is basically the native approach. And the challenge there is that you have to target many platforms, and each platform with its own language. And now that I can see you, actually, just to, I know that many of you are designers here, but I'd just like to know how many of you are iOS developers or develop natively for iOS? OK, so that's a bunch of you. How many are Android developers? OK. And the real question now is, how many of you are iOS and Android developers? OK, that's still a lot. So I'll have to add and throw in Windows Phone and maybe Bada to make my point. And that's how many. OK, I get it now. OK, and so my point is, it's complicated. And because we are pragmatic developers, we are always trying to make it simpler. And in this case, making it simpler means get that N down to one, N applications down to one application. And I have to tell you that lately I have seen one approach to get N down to one, and it goes like this. You start giving up on platforms. And I don't hear anybody crying yet, so let's keep going and see if it hurts a little more. OK, ouch. And now you're there with one app, and that's what you wanted, right? You have one app, but you gave up on platforms, you gave up on markets. So let's see if we can bring the other platforms back and come up with another approach. And what we really need is a kind of an abstraction layer that would enable cross-platform development. Now, do you know an abstraction layer that enables cross-platform development? There is one. There is one that millions of developers are using every single day to build cross-platform applications that run on all these devices in the browser. And that abstraction layer is called HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So now the question is, can we use the same stack? Can we use the same technologies, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, to build apps? Not apps that run in the browser, but apps that live on the home screen of your phone and apps that you install through the app stores. Is that possible? Can you do that, or is there some kind of a gap? And I think there are, in fact, two things that are missing. The first one is that you need a way to take that web application and package it as a native app, because that's the only thing you can submit to the app stores. And the second thing is that you need a way in your web application to access the capabilities of your device, like, for instance, the camera, the GPS, the accelerometer, the contacts, and things like that. So that's really the gap. And you may have guessed it already, but there is a solution to fill that gap. And that solution is PhoneGap. And that's exactly what PhoneGap is doing. PhoneGap is a wrapper and a bridge, if you want. It wraps your application as a native application, and it gives you a bridge to access from web technologies to access the native capabilities of your device. So let's take a closer look. PhoneGap is a wrapper. A PhoneGap application on each platform is a native application. It's a native application on each platform. And that blue frame that you're seeing on this slide is actually a mini native app on each platform. And the only thing it does is to wrap what we call a web view. And a web view is a native component that lets you render HTML in your native application. Now, that is, in fact, what we call a hybrid app. A hybrid app is a native app that provides most of its content in HTML through a web view in a native application. So the good news here is that you don't have to write that native app. That native app is part of the PhoneGap SDK on each platform. So you don't have to write any Objective-C or Java or other funny language here. It's all part of the PhoneGap SDK for each platform. So PhoneGap is also a bridge in the sense that it gives you a cross-platform JavaScript API to access all the native capabilities of your device. And that includes, as you see on this slide, the contacts, the camera, geolocation, and things like that, a file API, database API. And that means that in your application, you don't have to test the platform that the application is running on and then decide to invoke a specific version of the API. No, you always call the same cross-platform JavaScript API, and PhoneGap is going to do the magic behind the scenes. Now, if the W3C already has a standard or a proposal for one of these APIs, then PhoneGap is going to implement that. But if it doesn't, then again, PhoneGap will fill the gap and provide its own API in the meantime. Now, PhoneGap is also extensible through plugins. So if you're using a newer API or an API that's unique to one platform or some kind of native code that you wrote yourself for one platform, in short, if you're trying to access an API that we don't provide an abstraction for, then plugins are the way to go. And on this slide, you see a bunch of examples, like, for instance, local notification, push notification, barcode reader would be a good example of that. But there are many, many, many more plugins available on the PhoneGap plugins GitHub repository, and you have the URL there. But this is also another opportunity for you to help. Most of these plugins have actually been contributed by members of the community. And so you can write your own plugins and then submit them, and we'll host them on that page as well. OK, so now that we kind of understand what a hybrid application is, what a PhoneGap application is, I think a fair question to ask is when you want to go hybrid. Is a hybrid application the solution for all applications? Is hybrid always the answer? And the answer to that question is no. It's not about replacing native applications across the board. Can hybrid applications be a great solution for many applications? Absolutely. So the question now is, how do you know? How do you know if a hybrid application is right for you, if a PhoneGap application is right for you? Well, all applications are not equal, and there are really different factors that you need to consider. And I try to represent this on this chart. One factor to consider is how close to native you want your user experience to be. How extreme, how wild is your user experience in your application, if you want. And the second factor may be how important is it for you to support multiple platforms. So you have to look at these different factors and think about what you're building. Think about the application that you're building. Think about it. And then you try to plot it on this chart. Where does it fit? Where is your application on this chart? And if you're at the bottom right of this chart, it means that you care a lot about an absolutely native user experience and you don't care that much about cross-platform, then native may be totally right for you. If you're at the top left of this chart, you care a lot about cross-platform. You care a lot about running your application on different mobile platforms, and your application doesn't require a wild, user experience, then clearly a hybrid application is a great solution for you. Now, these are extremes, and obviously there are some shades of gray in the middle. So there is a line somewhere on this slide that we could draw. And to the right of that line, if you want, it would make sense to go native. And to the left of that line, it would make sense to go hybrid. Now, I can't tell you exactly where the line is, but one thing that I can tell you with what you saw this morning, for instance, with all the innovation in web standards, is that that line is moving, and it's clearly moving to the right. And the gap between what you can do natively and what you can do with web standards will continue to close. Now, to be totally honest with you, I think there is a third dimension, and I've seen that a lot talking to you guys and to customers like you or users like you, developers. I think there is a third axis to this chart, but I'm not good at PowerPoint. I'm not good enough to actually do a 3D chart, so I'll have to describe it. And I think the third axis is access to developer resources. If you have unlimited access to developers, then maybe native is right for you, regardless of the number of platforms that you want to support. In the same way, if your team of developers is made of domain experts, then maybe a hybrid solution is right for you, even if you target only 2 platforms or maybe only 1. So sometimes it's not clear when to choose which approach. So what I wanted to do was to give you some examples of applications for which the hybrid way was the right solution. During the Olympics, the BBC Olympics app lets you read the latest news, the latest scores, and watch online videos. You saw this morning that Untapped is another example of a hybrid application. And by the way, all the applications that I'm showing here are available on the different app stores. And Untapped, as you saw this morning, is a social network for people who like to drink beer. And I was told that that's a lot of people. And then in a kind of a different category of application, Salesforce.com recently released Salesforce Logger, which is a kind of a companion app that lets you access your recent activity on Salesforce, and then you can update status of accounts and contacts and things like that. And that application is also available on the App Store. Now, when we speak about PhoneGap application, you know, it's easy to understand what it is and give you some examples, and then people get excited and they want to know how they build them. And there is sometimes a little bit of confusion because people expect that, you know, in the PhoneGap SDK, they will find all sorts of goodies that will help them to actually, you know, build a polished application. And it's also very important, in the same way that I try to describe what PhoneGap is, a wrapper and a bridge, it's also extremely important to try to describe what it's not. And PhoneGap is not a UI framework. It's not even an MVC framework. It's not really a JavaScript framework in that sense. It's just a wrapper and a bridge. And that is by design, because we want to let you use the framework that you like, because that's a personal choice. It depends on the application that you're building. So the point is, PhoneGap is not a UI framework. It's not an MVC framework. You can use the framework that you like. You can go with a full-stack framework, like, for instance, Dojo or jQuery Mobile, or you can use another approach, which is the build-your-own-stack approach, and then pick and choose, you know, a DOM manipulation library like jQuery and Zepto, or and then on top of that, an MVC framework and a UI toolkit, like, for instance, Twitter Bootstrap or Foundation. Now, some of you may be a little confused because I've been speaking mostly about PhoneGap in this presentation so far, and you may also have heard the term Cordova. So what's the difference? So about a year ago, the people from Adobe, which is the company that created PhoneGap, initially joined Adobe. And at the same time, the PhoneGap code base was contributed to Apache. So today, Cordova is the Apache name for the project. It's the open source name for the project, if you want. And PhoneGap is the Adobe distribution of Cordova, complemented by some additional services that would be out of scope for an open source project at Apache. And so what I want to do now is really spend the rest of my time talking about one of these additional services, if you want, that we call PhoneGap Build. But first, let me set some context and try to describe the problem that PhoneGap Build is trying to solve. PhoneGap and Cordova solve the cross-platform problem. So you now have a single code base built with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that you can use to run on all these different platforms. But at some point, you're going to have to test your application on a device, or later, you're going to have to submit your application to an app store. And to do that, somehow you will have to compile, build your application to create the binaries that each platform expects. So you'll have to create an IPA for iOS, an APK for Android, etc. And that's another major pain point in the developer experience, because compiling the application for each platform means that you have to install the SDK for each mobile platform on your local computer. And that often means that you also have to install a specific IDE for each platform on your local computer. So for instance, if you're targeting iOS, you'll typically have to install Xcode on your machine. If you're targeting Android, you'll have to install the Android SDK plus Eclipse, and then Visual Studio for Windows Phone, and then it gets worse. So that's really the point. You know, as a developer, I can install 2 IDEs on my machine. I'm kind of fine with that. 3 becomes really tricky, and then more than that becomes impossible. So PhoneGap Build removes that requirement. What PhoneGap Build is, it's a build server that's hosted in the cloud. So with PhoneGap Build, you can write your application with the tool that you like, you know, Brackets or Dreamweaver, VI, Notepad, whatever you like. And then you'll check in your code in some code repository, and then you will point PhoneGap Build to that repository, and automatically PhoneGap Build will create the binaries for 6 mobile platforms, ready to install. If you provide your credentials, if you provide your developer certificate and an application provisioning profile, at least for iOS, your application will be ready to be deployed and to be submitted to the different app stores. So what I'd like to do now is to actually show you an example of how that would work. So I have an application here that I will first look at in a browser. And this application, hopefully you can see it. All right. It's a simple application that you may have seen before. It's an employee directory, and you see that I work in a kind of an interesting company. But what I did here was to enable a Chrome extension, which is called the Ripple Emulator. And in fact, this is a project that was built by the people at RIM that they contributed to open source recently. And we have been working with these guys to make it work really well with PhoneGap. So in fact, another way to get to the same point is to go to emulate.phonegap.com. And in here, you could type a URL where your application is, and there is your app, okay? And the nice thing about that, and actually let me change this to PhoneGap. The nice thing about this is that as a web developer, see, this application is entirely built with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So it's nice to be able to see in the browser how this is gonna work before I start moving to devices. But so here I kind of emulate an iPhone, as you can see, and now I could choose here another device and emulate the same application on an Android type of device. And you see that the skins that are applied are very different. So it is totally possible, as you can see here, in HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to have a very native-looking type of skin. And you can see that in the emulator, you don't really have to move to your device for testing that kind of stuff. So that's a nice way to kind of test your application before moving to your device. Now, what I'm going to do is really create the binaries to be able to install this application, to wrap this as an app that I will install on different devices. So as you saw this morning, to do that, we're going to move to build.phonegap.com. And yes, we want to leave this page. And so this is my own list of applications, if you want, on build.phonegap.com. And so what I'm going to create here is a new application. Now, this morning, what you saw is that you can upload your code in a zip file, which is kind of cool, but typically, if you iterate through your code, creating a zip file is not really the best way of doing it. Typically, you would check in your code in a repository, for instance, GitHub, and that's what I'm doing. So I'm going to go to GitHub here, and this is the list of my repositories, and I have that application that we've been looking at in a specific repository. So the only thing that I will do here is grab that URL, and then, go back to PhoneGap Build, and I can paste that link here. And now it's going to fetch the code from my GitHub repository into PhoneGap Build. So this should take just a few seconds if all goes well. I know that PhoneGap Build has been pretty busy today, so let's hope that it doesn't take too long. And here we go. It's done. So there are a couple of things that I can do here before generating the binaries, before building it. One thing that I want to do is to actually enable debugging. Because unfortunately, even though you can debug most of your application in the browser, for instance, in Chrome using the Chrome developer tools, sometimes it works. I know it shouldn't be the case, but sometimes it works in the browser, then you move it to your device and something doesn't work. Or maybe what you want to debug is really some of the unique features that are available only on a phone, like the camera, for instance. So I'm going to enable debugging, and I'm going to say, OK, I'm ready to build. Now, one thing you notice is that immediately iOS fails, and that was expected. Don't worry, I totally expected that. And the reason is that you can't build for iOS if you don't provide your developer certificate and an application provisioning profile. So I'm going to do that here, and I load it. So what you can do here is add your credentials. So you can add your developer certificate and an application provisioning profile. Or I already did that before, so I will simply do this. I will simply select it, and automatically now it's going to build, and you see that it's building for 6 different platforms at this point. And so you see that it's queued, so one by one the different binaries will appear here. So hopefully it's not going to take too long. There is sometimes with the BlackBerry server a signing issue, so sometimes I've noticed that it fails, and in that case, you simply rebuild, and in general, it works fine. And then I'm just waiting for the IPA. OK, so it has been built for the 6 different platforms here. So as you saw this morning, what I'm just going to do here is scan the QR code. And in my phone, it says, OK, do you want to install it from PhoneGap Build? And I will say yes. And so I'll put that here. And it's installing the application at this point. and it's going pretty fast, so we're good. And now I can start testing the application. You see that, in fact, you can define the icons. You can define the splash screen. Maybe we can have a split screen, and I can show you here the way you would define that in your code. There is a config file that you can provide. And in that config file, you would provide the icons, the splash screen for all the different platforms here. So let's look at the application and see how it works. So OK, so it kind of works as expected here. I can navigate through my directory, and that looks great. Now, that may not always be the case. So you may find a problem or need to debug something. So straight from the build.phonegap.com page, you have that debug button that I will use at this point. And you see that automatically, because I enabled debugging, the connection was made with the phone. And so now I can start inspecting the elements. And so, for instance, I can dive in here and into my search page. I can look at the header. Oh, OK, so that's the title of the header. Now, would I have, for instance, enough? Maybe I don't like employee directory. I would like to change it and see if it fits. So from my browser, I could change it to, let's say, Office directory, for instance. And you should see it on the phone. Maybe I'll just restore the application here because, oops. OK, so let's do that again. All right, here we go. All right, and go in the body, the content, search page. OK, we have the header here, and I'm going to try again. OK. And here we go. OK, so you can start inspecting. You can start changing, so, and see, apply different styles and things like that, and remotely debug and inspect your application, which is cool. But there is one more thing that you can do in that interface that you see in Chrome here. You can really access the console. So, for instance, if I was to search for employees, for instance, I will do that. All these LIs, if you want, all these line items are actually wrapped in a div with a style called story. Okay? And so because my application uses jQuery, I can actually really send JavaScript commands to the phone and say, for instance, that HTML, that I want to replace all the names with John, for instance, as a simple example of what would be doable. And here we go, simply sending jQuery or JavaScript commands in general. I could even say, I can even send a message, for instance. All right, let's try that. And send it, and here we go. It works, so you can really send these JavaScript commands to the phone. So that's what I wanted to show you in terms of the demo. So to kind of summarize what we talked about here, we covered two things. We covered Cordova and PhoneGap. And that really gives you a cross-platform development approach for all these different mobile devices. And if you want to start using these products, you can go to the Apache website or to the PhoneGap website, and you can start downloading and using the product. And then once you have written that application and you have to compile it and build it for different platforms, PhoneGap Build is really a great way to do that because you don't have to install different IDEs, you don't have to install different SDKs, and you can start using it right away by going to build.phonegap.com. So I hope you'll do that, and I hope you'll enjoy building applications with PhoneGap, and that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much.